When I was 6, my grandfather passed away. He was my grandmother's second husband, who she married late in life, so the mood of my parents going to the funeral was more of obligation as opposed to respect or sorrow. While my mother spent much of her life not knowing the man, he was the only grandfather I had known on my mom's side. But I didn't feel any sadness as we drove through the gray drizzle that day. Instead, I would say I felt relieved. As long as I could remember, my grandfather had referred to himself as the tickle monster and would mercilessly tickle me whenever we visited or when he and my grandmother came to our house. And I don't mean that kind of quick poke adults do to make kids give a little squirm and laugh. I mean the long and agonizing torture kind of tickling, the kind that persisted until I would pee a little or cry, or more often, both. Grandparent visits became a source of shame and fear, something I hated because my grandmother was an amazing woman. She lost her first husband when the oldest of her 3 girls was only 10. Single-handedly, she raised them all, sent them off to college, and saw them all take on careers, marry, and have kids of their own. And all of it done in an era where single mothers were considered far from the norm. She had a strength and resilience that really spoke to me. Yet seeing her also meant enduring the torture and embarrassment of the tickle monster. My grandfather had suffered a severe workplace injury to his left leg, so it dragged a bit when he walked. I would sometimes hide when he and my grandmother arrived at our house, in hopes he'd get involved with adult talk and such and not attack me. But I always heard that sound. Step, drag, step, drag, coming in search of me. Here comes the tickle monster. You'd think a small child would easily evade an older man with a bad leg, but his ability to catch me was near supernatural. We arrived at the funeral home. It was a white Gothic design with an extended front to mimic a tower and steepled roofs adorned with gingerbread-style decorations. Framed against the gray skies, the building seemed to glower down at me. My father got out of the car, popping an umbrella open and using it to shelter my mother. Appropriate day for a funeral. Thankfully, my mother's expression shut down any further attempts by my father to be funny. While they walked ahead, an umbrella shared between them. I trudged along with cold splatters of rain nipping at my skin. The interior was decorated with dark carpeting, white walls, and dark iron sconces for lighting. Members of our extended family already waited in the main lobby. My parents disappeared into the group, making the typical small talk. Hey, Squirt. I flinched at the familiar nickname and snide tone. My older cousins, Michael and Tom, stood just behind me. Michael was 9, the oldest, and enjoyed tormenting me almost as much as my grandfather had enjoyed tickling. Tom was a year younger than Michael, not nearly as mean, but would do nothing to go against his brother. Before I could respond, my mother came to fetch me. We entered a room off the reception area. The seating were lines of church pews. At the front of them was a podium to the left, and centered before them was the casket where my grandfather lay. My mom dragged me up to the casket, which was open, and urged me to pay my last respects. I didn't really understand what that meant, so I just remained silent, staring at the face of my grandfather, who looked familiar, but also different. My father came to stand beside us. They did a really good job. My mother agreed. I said nothing because, again, I had no idea what he meant. I'll say here that I think bringing a child to an open casket service and having discussions about the job they did is kind of messed up. After standing a few minutes in silence, My parents led me to a front pew where we sat for the remainder of the funeral service. I don't remember much of what was said. It didn't mean much to me at the time. I recall hearing sniffles and seeing people nod at some of the words and not understanding what they were agreeing with. I assumed they must have known something I didn't. My grandmother sat straight-backed and poker-faced. To my then 6-year-old eyes, she was like a statue, strong and stoic. It comforted me that she too wasn't crying or nodding along. I felt less strange for being quiet and not feeling much of any particular emotion. When the service came to an end, we were ushered out into another room set up with tables and a selection of small sandwiches and punch. "Hey, Squirt!" I knew no one was going to come save me this time. "Hey, Michael." He wore his usual smug grin. Tom hung back a few feet behind him. "Your mom said she left her purse back in the room with Grandpa and she wants you to go and get it." I scanned the room for my mother, but couldn't immediately find her. "You should get going. She'll be mad if you don't listen." Even at 6, I knew this was fishy. Why would she tell you to tell me? He glowered at me. "Are you calling me a liar, Squirt?" I honestly thought he was, but I didn't have the courage to say it out loud. "No." His smile at my answer looked too triumphant. "Then you better get going." "Will you come with me?" I thought his goal was to have me wander off and then tell my mom, which to my mind meant if he came with me, I'd avoid his plan. Sure thing, Squirt. Being alone with a dead body is pretty scary. I wouldn't make you go alone. I felt overconfident at the time, thinking I'd overcome him. I was wrong in the worst possible way. When we arrived at the chapel, I went straight for where we had sat. I wanted to get in and out of there as fast as possible. I'd made it to the pew and found it empty, just as the doors closed. I ran back and knocked on the door. "That's not funny, Michael. Open the door." I didn't see a lock, but I couldn't get the door to budge either. I assumed he was still standing on the other side, holding it closed. "Open the door, or I'm telling." I kept knocking, but the door didn't budge, and I couldn't hear anything on the other side. "Daniel." My name seemed to echo from each corner of the room in that distinct sing-song way adults use when they come searching during hide-and-seek. I shivered, not just because the room suddenly felt so cold, but because of who often said my name that way, and because I knew what would come next. I looked behind me to where the casket sat. My grandfather's head was turned toward me, cloudy eyes wide. Although my name seemed to come from all around the room, now his dead mouth moved, tearing the stitches used to keep it closed. "Here comes the tickle monster." I screamed so loud I felt like my throat was tearing. I twisted and yelled at the door, "Let me out! Help me!" I took a hesitant glance behind me. My grandfather lay in his coffin, eyes closed, still in the way only death could bring. I tried to get my breathing under control and calm my hammering heart. My breath caught, and I scanned the room with wide eyes. I couldn't tell where it came from. I kept checking to see if my grandfather's body had moved, but it remained motionless in the coffin. My skin prickled with a static charge. I felt someone near me. I could hear them breathe. My body spasmed as if something brushed against my side, my most ticklish side my grandfather always exploited. I dropped to the ground, bawling into a defensive position, but no further assaults occurred. From my periphery, I caught a shadowy mass, but when I looked, there was nothing. The door behind me opened, making me jump and gasp. My mother stood there, her expression quickly morphed from concern to anger.
"What are you doing in here? And why did you have the door closed?"
My voice was hoarse from screaming and tears. "Michael locked me in here. I was trying to get out." She folded her arms, her toe tapping impatiently.
"He and Tom have been with their parents. It's not nice to tattle, especially if it's a lie."
"But I didn't bother saying anything more. As I rose from the floor and followed behind my mother, I cast a final glance back at my grandfather's body. His head turned toward me. He gave me a wink, and I heard his same laugh as every other time his tickling had reduced me to tears.